Good evening, and welcome in out of the cold. I'm Sylvia Yunt, the Lawrence A. Fleischman Curator in charge of the American Wing, and I'm very pleased to introduce this special evening of conversation and reflection, marking the semi-quincentennial of the birth of the United States, or in more common parlance, the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We're grateful to the Jerome Levy Foundation, who made this program possible in honor of Marvin Schwartz, in addition to our education colleagues at the Met, Mariana Siciliano and Gabrielle Mungo, for their essential assistance. Tonight, we will hear from this country's most celebrated and popular visual storyteller, Ken Burns, along with his colleague, Sarah Botstein, whose latest impressive collaboration is the American Revolution documentary, currently streaming on PBS. While I trust many of you have already experienced the full 12 hours of astonishing content, the program this evening will begin with a roughly 30-minute highlight reel that frames our focus on the art of the revolution, including key works from the Met's collection. After that viewing, there will be among the filmmakers and 3 scholars a discussion of how the documentary's varied visual narratives were conceived and ultimately realized. That conversation will be moderated by Professor of History of Art, Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw from the University of Pennsylvania, who's actually curating an exhibition addressing the American Revolution in a Philadelphia context titled At Liberty, an exhibition to which the Met is lending, opening at Penn's Arthur Ross Gallery in late June. In addition, we will hear from 2 of the historians who advised on and are memorably featured in the documentary, as well as having contributed penetrating essays to the companion publication by Jeffrey Ward and Ken Burns. And that is Philip J. Deloria of Harvard University and Jane Kamensky, formerly of Harvard, now president and CEO of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. We in the American Wing have had the great pleasure of collaborating with all 3 of these esteemed scholars on various projects in the past, but tonight is the first time that Ken Burns and Sarah Botstein together are gracing the stage of the Met, which is very exciting. And I want to thank Dr. Deloria especially for facilitating the introduction to Sarah Botstein last year, when I first began to conceive of this event as one of the centerpieces of the museum's commemoration of the semi-quincentennial, in conjunction with a new cross-departmental installation on view in the American Wing, Revolution, funded by Kimba Wood and Frank Richardson. And we'll also be offering a series of gallery talks and very special musical performances throughout this summer, so stay tuned for information about those programs. I'm showing you a view of our special display in dialogue with perhaps the most iconic revolutionary subject in the Met's collection, Emanuel Leutze's Washington Crossing the Delaware, which, like so much of the history explored in the PBS documentary, is far more complex and contested than it appears. The ongoing reckoning with this epic work by generations of artists, from the leading Black American painter of the mid-20th century, Jacob Lawrence, to the contemporary Cree painter, Kent Monkman, both works in the Met's collection, reveals the critical role art plays in shaping expressions of national identity, in the process defining so-called origin stories, a theme that the panel will actually explore tonight. In light of the American Wing's evolving presentation and interpretation of our wide-ranging collections of historical art and design in ever more expansive and inclusive terms, to explore truthful, object-based narratives about our shared past and present, the American Revolution documentary particularly resonates here at the Met. Given that, it's a great honor to launch our semi-quincentennial commemoration with what I know will be an engaging and enlightening program tonight. Thank you all for being here to mark this historic moment and to share a meaningful experience in community at an extraordinary time for this country. I now give you the man himself, Ken Burns, who will introduce the clip reel. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvia. I heard a couple people laugh on the presumption that they'd watched all 12 hours, so I've asked the Metropolitan to lock the doors, and we will watch all 12 hours right now. On behalf of Sarah Botstein, one of my co-directors on this, we want to express how deeply grateful we are to be here this evening at the Met, this extraordinary factory and laboratory for art. It's so great to move through its bowels and then out a side door into the American wing and turn a corner and see a Bierstadt and see this or see that. We've been kind of smitten, of course, every time we come here. We're grateful also that we have a place to show all our films for the last 50 years, and that's the Public Broadcasting Service. And we don't do it without a host of funders in addition to PBS that you'll see at the end of this clip reel. I'm also happy to say that other people who advised us are in the audience, including the writer Stacy Schiff, who is making a second appearance after our Benjamin Franklin. We're so happy to have her here. And the scholars Christopher Brown and Michael Witkin, who add immeasurably, as Stacy does, to the various perspectives of this film. Also here on our staff are the two folks sort of most responsible for wrangling paintings and other visual material, and that's Salima El Amin and Vicky Lee. So thank you, Salima and Vicky. So there's a problem right off the bat in telling a story about our origin story, and that is there are no photographs and there are no newsreels. It is a daunting realization. It took us years to finally screw up the courage to be able to do this, to try to tell the stories of the 18th century without any photographs or newsreels. And so we found ourselves, once the decision had been made in December of 2015, if you want to set your watches, that's when Barack Obama had 13 months to go in his presidency. We did this, no thought of 250, no thought of, you know, what's going on now. That we had to do a significant recalibration, and that included emphasizing live cinematography of the real star of our film, which is in fact the land itself. You know, this war is a revolution, it's a civil war, it's also a global war, perhaps the 5th global war over the prize of North America. And when you say prize, you mean land, and when you mean land, you mean other people's land. So there's a lot of live cinematography. We also had to do reenactments, something I had eschewed in the past, but we spent many years trying to treat them in a kind of painterly fashion. Lots of documents, tactile sort of possession of the feeling of the writings of the time, whether it's a 15-year-old soldier or Thomas Jefferson. Lots of maps. I've been a map freak. This film has more maps than all of our other films combined, and they really work. I'm not upset about that admission. But mostly they're paintings, and they're drawings, and they're watercolors. In one case, you'll see in a little bit, somebody, an Irish soldier named Roger Lamb, that's combining watercolors and drawings along with his prose of what went on. And we're drawing this material from every period up to the very present. There are, of course, the Trumbulls and the Peels and the Copleys and the Stewarts and the Reveres who claim some relationship to the moment, but with the exception of Revere, maybe a couple of other ones, most of the paintings take place after the end of the war on October 17th, 1781. And so therefore, there was a kind of license that we felt not only did we need to take, but we also wanted to take and wanted to embrace, that sent us through the decades of the 19th and well into the 20th century, and indeed up to the present moment. So paintings became our photographs. We've always, in a way, tried to will them alive, you know, with close shots and extreme close-ups and pans and zooms and tilts and all of the things that we do, and to bring them alive with narration, but also first-person voice. And there's scores of people in our film that sort of fix where the revolution is from the variety of their positions, not just the familiar bold-faced top-down names, but scores of people I had never heard when I began this and who populate our film, I'm happy to say. and music and sound effects to sort of help will the pictures alive. So I am very much interested in the conversation we're going to have afterwards. We'll look at, as we say, about a 30-minute clip reel. I don't need to put you in any places. We'll start with partial part of the introduction and then drop you in many places. And if you feel lost narratively, look at the paintings. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Gwendolyn DuBois Shaw, and I'll be moderating the conversation tonight. I want to welcome you all, and I want to welcome our panel. It's the semi-quincentennial. I remember 1976, I was a little kid. It was so super exciting, all of the parades and everything. And here we are at this moment. But this film began a while back. Can you talk a little bit, Ken, about the genesis and how long you all have been working on this and why start streaming it in 2025, right before?
Well, we first started broadcasting it, and streaming came too, but mainly we broadcast it on PBS. I was 23 when the bicentennial happened, and I remember being unimpressed because it seemed to be a lot of fife and drum treacle and kind of very superficially considered. The tall ships in the harbor was fabulous. That was great, but there was no meat on the bone at all. And so I don't know if that was the genesis, or it was certainly ideas, but we were terrified of it, as I explained, because there are no photographs. And then we we're in the middle of finishing our film on the Vietnam War. It was 2015, as I explained earlier, December. And we were looking at a map of the Ia Drang Valley in the Central Highlands, one of our maps that had some dimension, and you were moving through it, and you saw where the American and the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong positions were. And I just thought, oh, that could be the British moving west on Long Island toward Brooklyn Heights, and we're going to do the revolution, which was like kind of an idiot thing to say, but everybody sort of took a deep breath. And I think it was really the idea that having done the Civil War and having done World War II and the Vietnam War, we're sort of obligated to go back. There was no talk, as I said, about 250, nothing. It wasn't in our minds or our radar. We knew it would take about 10 years, and it was only halfway through that we began to think we're going to end up a year before that, but it's still Lexington and Concord, it's still Bunker Hill, it's still a lot of really important markers, and we'd already passed the Boston Tea Party and before that, the Boston Massacre. So, you know, it was ripe for a more complex kind of telling, and that's what we wanted to do. And it involved voices, and it involved narrative, and we worked with these people and many more, as I mentioned in the audience, who just helped us refine how we could tell a story. So it's not an additive process. You're not building a house. You're taking 500 hours of material and distilling it, boiling it down to the 12 hours. So you are constantly aware of the negative space of creation, that which you're not using, but also understanding about the extraordinary triage that takes place in order to perform not just good history, but good storytelling, good art, whatever the conversation may take us.
Yeah, it's such a familiar past and yet so strange. And I wanted us to start with these images of George Washington, because Washington is super familiar to everyone. You know, if you're still carrying cash or coins, you have Washington in your pocket probably, right, on the dollar bill. We're very familiar with these images. But at the start of the film, you make Washington really strange to us. At least for me, it was a huge surprise to learn about his land speculation.
Yeah, I don't think it's strange. We're calling balls and strikes, and I'll turn it over to Jane, because he is all of these things. The problem with the fife and drum treacle is he just becomes just whatever Parson Weems said he was a generation later, that he, cherry tree, never telling a lie, throwing a coin across the Potomac. And he's much more complicated. I wouldn't say strange, complicated, and much more interesting, and we don't have a country without him.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of, I think if we're going to talk about art, He's one of the essential men of the revolution. One of the interesting things about him artistically is there are spurious images of Washington circulating in Britain and on the continent because people are dying to know what he looks like, and there's not a circulating image in the mid-1770s. So he becomes identified with the country very early on, even though many people in Virginia and Kentucky knew his full and complicated backstory from the French and Indian War and before.
And Jane, could you say something about these two pictures and the way that Washington is represented in them?
So represented as a military hero, right arm akimbo. We're looking at Peel with the blue sash and Trumbull. Thank you. He's not my guy. Fascinatingly, in the Trumbull, we have one of his enslaved retinue, I think Billy Lee, shown in livery with his turban. And one of the fascinating things that the film has done is picked up all of the people who are there in the picture for what art historians call stoffage, right? They're staffing out, they're building out local color, and treated them both filmically and with documentary evidence as fully rounded actors in their own right.
Yeah, I think that's a really marvelous thing about the film, is that we begin to get more of that texture. Because in these two paintings, the figures in the background are really just, that, as kind of these, these stock characters.
But you know what? Can I just say, if you're able to go back to Washington, particularly with the William Lee, his manservant child, in film we can go into him, start with him, and move to Washington. And so what you have, the cinematic difference, is this control that you have. You regulate the amount of time the audience sees it. You can stand in front of this Trumbull for hours if you wish to and drink in all of the things that you like or dislike about it. We're regulating the amount of time, but we're also regulating what you first see and then what you don't see. So you start with William Lee and we move over on what would be called a close-up or an extreme close-up across from him to his enslaver, George Washington. And that's an interesting dynamic that helps to pull out the details of the images that Jane was speaking about.
Yeah. These were a revelation for me. I'd never seen these Roger Lamb drawings before. And Sarah, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about how the team found these, where are they? And then, as Ken was describing the kind of the pan and scan and moving around a painting, these drawings have so much going on in them, right? There's text, there's image, there's scenes happening, there are individuals. The scale is different for the figures. Some of them are big, some of them are little. How do you deal with that directorially?
I'm going to try to answer all the different parts of your question, which are all so wonderful things that we wrestled with for years in the editing room. So just go back. We learned Roger Lamb wrote after the war, and so his writings are fairly familiar to people studying the American Revolution in the 18th century. I don't know what that means in a popular imagination, but people have heard of Roger Lamb. Don Haggis, who's the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, who was an advisor to the project, knew that we had some Roger Lamb quotes in the film and came to a screening and said, oh, well, he has drawings. And we went, oh my God, Roger Lamb has drawings. And then we found some not very good copies of them, and we have a tenacious associate producer named Rosie who found a much better source of those in Dublin, actually, through a Methodist church. I mean, this is just what we do and why it takes us 10 years to make these films. But, and then we brought them in, and our editor, Maya, I wish she was here, we went, oh my God, how are we gonna use them? How are you gonna, do you have to stop and write a whole thing about it? Do you have to explain to the audience? Is the audience gonna get it? Do you need to see which words? And then we started to realize, okay, well, not all the uniforms are right, but he happened to be at a whole bunch of places that we're talking about in the film. So we just put one foot in front of the other and experimented and tried different ways of of using the watercolors, and then, of course, Jane McCrae is this incredible moment where you go, oh my God, Roger Lamb.
It's cinematic, though, because if you look at the Jane McCrae one, there's the two Native Americans sort of capturing her, but they're confronting her just to the left. It's the same person. And so you realize that he has got this incredibly cinematic, and so we had to, early on, acknowledge Roger Lamb, who he was when we introduced him, and the fact that he was doing this. And it's the only time, there's one other time where we break the fourth wall and explain to the viewers, it has to do with the American flag, that the Stars and Stripes, as we know it, were sort of designed at that time, but we don't know that it ever actually flew over any revolutionary battle. But Jeff Ward said very artfully, sort of tucking it in a subordinate clause, but it populates many of the romanticized post-war images of battle, and that was the way we could tolerate the Stars and Stripes in a painting, but also acknowledge the more important, I think, reality that, there's a lot of stuff that didn't happen, and we don't ever mention the word in the entire film, Betsy Ross. So sorry.
Yeah, when the film got to that point, I'm like, and you're not going to say her name.
We don't know who made the first flag, is what we
who.
say. And nobody says don't fire, and you see the whites of their eyes. And I'm sorry to say that, the spy captured after the fall of New York, Nathan Hale, does not say, or we not sure he said, I regret that I have but one life to live for my country. The British officer who hung him noticed that he had gone to his death with great composure. That's what we say.
So speaking of Jane McCrae, the little Roger Lamb picture, so, you are there, right? He's recounting this scene that has happened, in his orbit. Vanderlyn comes later, right? This is 1804. And this Howard Pyle, The Nation Makers, is 1903. As an art historian, like if I was teaching class, I'd be like, these are two totally different things.
That's how we started.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, okay, we're gonna be as true. We always have rules in the editing room. Okay, we're in Vietnam, it's gonna be a Marine. We're gonna be in the right place, we're gonna be in the right zone. You're in World War II, it has to be the right unit. We get as close to the documentary evidence as we possibly can, and then we quickly realized there's 250 years of interpreting this history, and we're gonna bring it all in and see how it feels.
Yeah, it was really, it was interesting. It was also kind of shocking for me. And with this image, Phil, you talked about this image, by way of the kind of stereotyping and the romanticizing that goes on in it. And also the impact that an image like this has. Can you say a little bit more about what Vanderlyn is doing here?
Well, I am not an art historian. I'm very adjacent to art history, but I think an art historical perspective, right, would look at the real representational politics of this. The Indian bodies, right, which are so muscular, right? The famous, is it Benjamin West, who sees the Apollo Belvedere and says, how like a young Mohawk warrior he is with his muscled, right? So the bodies of these Indians are actually reflecting certain kinds of canons, and then the ways in which the darkness and then the bright light surrounding Jane McCrae, right? The sort of half-exposed bosom, so there's different things which are being drawn out of various kind of artistic practices that you're familiar, right, and create these sorts of messages. This is one of the things I think that's happening here, and you can see the difference between this and the Lamb image, right, which is sort of a caricature sketch, and now we've got a sort of fully realized mythological thing that has had some time, right, to ferment, right, and take on these other kinds of characteristics.
But that kind of jumping in time, you just think about it, darker-skinned people and white women. This is a trope that goes all the way through to the Central Park Five.
Yeah.
Right? This is what we do in our country. We make them of other people and don't ask questions, as we do of Ty and Danae, about who he is. Who he might be. And I think the Jane McCrae story, and as I think Phil points out, she's migrating from a red hair to a blonde, because this is, of course, the vulnerable
damsel.
Yeah, and if I just go back, and if folks look up in the corner at Roger Lamb's Jane McCrae, we don't even see her face,
No.
right? She's turned, she's just, we know that it's her because he's written her name there, and and she's kneeling in this way. But that kind of aestheticization and fetishization
That's right.
of her, hasn't happened yet. It doesn't happen until later when we have somebody like Vanderlyn who's trying to make his name. Howard Pyle, the nation makers, this is such a remarkable illustration, and this is, Pyle towards the end of his career,
Yep.
making this image of these guys kind of coming forward, and Pyle, as an illustrator in the early 20th century, was so famous for making these kinds of, stereotypes. How did you deal with these kinds of illustrations that people might have been familiar with from children's books?
I spent a lot of time in the children's section of every place we went, actually trying to think about not only how we've taught the history over so much time, but how we visualize the history for children. I have 2 kids at home, and I actually think it's really helpful for us when we're telling stories before the photographic record, or stories that are complicated like this, of how we teach them. And so, I think this is just also a great painting.
Great painting.
So, we all have different taste, and we have different aesthetic sensibilities, and the war has been painted and represented mostly around our anniversaries, actually. So it was fun to think and look at every 50 years, how are we painting, what are we looking at, what are we saying, what are we writing, how are we, thinking about it even musically. So the anniversaries helped us in figuring out images.
So the painting of George Washington, if you can remember, on the left, doesn't look as much like George Washington on the right. There's even others that don't feel like they're him, and they just feel different in faces. So you run into a problem. What's nice about Pyle, I think, is that he explodes this notion of the continental soldier, or the militiaman, the Minuteman, who's come to this is a ragged army. And what's so interesting about the revolution is that it is actually fought by teenagers, and we follow several of them, and it's fought by ne'er-do-wells and people looking for pardons and recent immigrants, and so this second and third sons without a chance of an inheritance. So this idea of these guys in Philadelphia, propertied white men free of debt, that's who they're making this country for. But in order to win it, it's like the motley crew there. Or as you saw in the scene at Valley Forge, you're not talking about this singular one face of America, the sort of the blood and soil argument of today. Because if you further that, it's all Native American if it's blood and soil. But it's a really diverse, just think of all the languages being spoken and the types of human beings that are there at Valley Forge, and it belies a sort of monochromatic notion of the American Revolution.
Speaking of what's missing, right? There were some illustrations, images, these watercolors that were commissioned for the film to bring in some of what was not in the historical record. And I know this is a big favorite of yours, Phil. Could you talk about why this image resonated so much for you?
Well, partly, I love the watercolors, actually, and the way that they function here relative to sort of the classic oil paintings, right? They pop off the screen as being different. They have, even though they're watercolors, right, they have almost a photographic kind of quality to them. There's a sort of being there, sort of urgency to them that I've just really enjoyed watching the film. This one in particular, though, I think works so well. For me, it's a really brilliant moment of filmmaking. And Ken, it goes to the point that you were just making about the diversity. Here, so in this image, when we're looking at it right now, the black horse is basically centering, our visual field. But what you do in the film is to do the close-up on those 3 native figures that are on the left-hand side. And it's a very tight close-up. And it happens right as Christopher Brown is saying, there are many, many diverse people, and Native people are part of this, and they are in the cities. And suddenly it's like, so for me, the resonance between the sort of narrator or the narrative that Christopher Brown is offering, the interpretive thing, and the image which captures these 3 Native figures in complicated dress against a brick windowed background, You know, it's just this, for me, it was a fabulous kind of moment. And then what happens in the film, if you're recalling this, right, the camera pulls back, and we get a larger shot of this as Michael Whitkin is saying, like, all the stuff you think about Indians is oversimplified. Let me tell you how complicated it was. And then what follows is, I'm not sure if it's the same artist, but it is another watercolor showing this massive Haudenosaunee village. And I think that image as well stands in relation to, for example, the opening scene and the other scenes where we see a single longhouse. Right. This thing of stacking 6 and 7 and 8 of these things together, as Michael is saying, like, these are nations, right? These are as important as anyone in Virginia or New York. I mean, for me, like, the power of this moment of filmmaking, of the visual cues, as you mentioned, Ken, as we were watching this backstage, the dog actually barks. You know, and the way that the image itself has these multiple kinds of functions as you're panning across it is just, you know, to me, really, really striking. I felt a kind of a, whoa, you know, when I saw this for the first time.
What was involved in commissioning these? Did you, you know, give direction? Just say, we need a street scene in Philadelphia?
Kind of. We, again, thanks to one of the exhibitions at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia and some other books, we brought in all these watercolors. In the first visual pass of the film, we all loved them. Jeff loved them, Ken loved them, David loved them, I loved them, Salima and Vicky, who are here. And we got in touch with the artists, and they seemed excited. And then over the course of making the film, we commissioned 12 new ones in different moments where there was nothing else visual, or it just felt like it would be right for the reasons Phil is saying. You kind of get used to them. You wait for them in each episode. When are they going to come? What are they going to be saying? Who's going to be portrayed? And Greg Harlan, who's the watercolorist, just, I mean, he does a lot of historic research. He talks to a lot of people, but he also just has a beautiful, I think, subtle way of being subtle and representative at the same time, and not pretending that he's honest with what he's trying to do. And I think that comes across in the watercolors.
So when you're in a place like this, you would have native peoples who were fully assimilated into American culture. You would have people that were struggling to coexist, and then you'd have lots of nations that were trading, that were coming in, and different as Virginia is to New York, or as important, but also as varied as, say, France is from Prussia. And I think what we do by making them on the frontier is to reduce the fact that, as we said in the opening line, this would would be a bloody struggle that would eventually engage more than 24 nations, European as well as Native American, privileging the Native American status as individual nations with the equal importance of Spain and the Netherlands and Prussia and Germany and Britain in this story. And it's the only way to roll. That's balls and strikes.
And it's a great moment where actually Roger Lamb comes in as you're making that argument. And it's like, and the Sauk, and the, Chippewa, and Dakota, and other kinds of people are coming from all, it makes us aware that it's a continental, native for native people, continental kind of struggle, continental awareness of what's going on, right, on this sort of Atlantic coast.
And I think the blending of media and centuries that would not be okay in an art history class here serves a higher purpose, right? You're telling a story of a country that is made by masses of ordinary people who we can't see, and you're telling it in a visual medium. The film lasts, I think, about 1,000 minutes altogether, and you are seeing images at a much higher refresh rate than once a minute in many cases. So somebody has to take those people as being as real as you and me. You have to be seeing a proxy for them and not repeatedly footnoting, don't pay attention to this face, this is a later recreation. I think it's a brilliant and generous strategy to try to use every tool that you've got to bring this place as close to the life of the time as you possibly can.
And there's, and because we're focusing on the visual, that oral dimension is super important, not just the narrative engine of Jeff's script, but the first-person voices that are read by some of the greatest actors in the world, and by the sound effects and the music, all of which, I mean, there may be 25 tracks over that picture. that in addition to Michael and backwards to Chris, in addition to dog barking, wagon wheels turning, a horse whinny, footfalls, air, birds, that all of it is this attempt, as Jane said, and not paradoxically, but the live cinematography or the reenactments are themselves more impressionistic, more an attempt to sort of give you a feeling, as Jane was saying, that there are real people as real as you and me living it. That's our main thing. So we're not looking to recreate a battle or a particular moment as much as we are collecting a kind of critical mass of material over 6 years that will then become things on the shelf that the editors can pull down and try to work together into it. And what's so nice, and we haven't shown it here, but in the Battle of Long Island, for example, the movement between the live cinematography, a musket volley of British soldiers going into a painting, showing a musket volley of British soldiers panning over across the battlefield, just works. And you know, it took a few years before we were even going to go whether there was any proof of concept. And one of the ones that made me sort of exhale just a little bit or let down my full weight was at that moment where live went to painting or painting went to live, and you weren't missing a beat. It was sort of various ways of willing this story that is so distant to us and so superficialized and kind of sanitized over the course of the decades and centuries that to help it sort of make it. And the reason why I like that Howard pile is because it's a little bit ragged, and they were.
I mean, the Howard pile is really interesting and important, I think. I mean, you know, for me, sitting in Massachusetts, so many of the images of the Revolution are these happy, tidy farmers from Lexington. Yeah. And we know that by the end of the war, right, it is the most ragged, backcountry people, right, who are not the tidy farmers of Lexington. Nope. And I think this gives us that sort of picture and feeling. It takes us into a different kind of place. I'd also say that, you know, I mean, I think it's exactly right that in many cases the reenactments become impressionistic. Right. And they even can become abstract. I mean, for me, one of my favorite images is the one that really ends at that opening clip where it's the drone shot, right, of a sort of
You don't
group.
know what it is to begin
You don't know
with.
what it is. It becomes completely abstract in a certain kind of way, right? You could be down in the George Morrison gallery looking at that show right now, seeing abstract forms and figures and lines, and then the muskets go off and you're brought back to what it is. I mean, it feels quite brilliant visually to me.
Just to segue between this and the next image, as you all were talking, I was thinking about the immediacy of watercolor and the choice to have these watercolors, because for Roger Lamb, he was able to do watercolor because it's a mobile art form that you can carry with you, you know, kind of in your pocket. And, you know, we talk about watercolor drawings or watercolor sketches, you know, as kind of really being immediate and bringing you there. But a painting like this, Jane, right, this is a whole other endeavor. And I would just love for you to talk about Copley and the way that Copley moves from the American context to the British context to making paintings like this, which are so different from, and we'll talk about in a minute, the Paul Revere.
So, give me back Paul Revere for a second.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
So Copley is born on the Long Wharf in Boston, which means he's born in Britain, and comes of age yearning for art. He's almost entirely self-taught, and what he can paint in the colonies is images like this Paul Revere, which he paints within a 2-week period in the fall of 1768 when Britain is occupying Boston, within a 2-week period of when he paints General Thomas Gage. So he's painting all comers without sides in the conflict, though he is himself, for a time, a son of liberty in the Boston chapter. But the whole time, in fact, at the time he paints Revere, he has already begun a transatlantic correspondence with Benjamin West, who has left Pennsylvania for London, with Joshua Reynolds at the Royal Academy, and others. How can I get over there? How can I, as he puts it, come home, right? Come home to this place that he's never seen. And if you go back to Pearson, the reason he wants to come home is because he wants to do something like this. I think in Copley's Boston period, which is the first 38 years of his life, there's not a single history painting in the British colonies, not a single one. The Grand Manner paintings that Copley is creating of people like Sam Adams are a kind of history painting in a portrait, but all he's got are these people with their faces who come in and for various reasons of dynasty and vanity and achievement want a record of themselves. He goes to London as a political exile, but also as an artistic student in 1774 and 5, takes the Grand Tour. And then by the time this is painted, this is 1781, January of 1781, Britain has badly bungled the war, is losing, but has not lost it yet. This is the Battle of Jersey, not New Jersey, but the Isle of Jersey. It's a 15-minute engagement between the British Army and some rump French legionnaires. It's not even an official battle. There's the struggle to paint something that a British market wants to see in a losing war, right? Imagine painting history paintings of Vietnam in the United States in 1969, and that's kind of his struggle. And I think in addition to just the staggering beauty of this painting, it's in Tate Britain and deserves to be seen. It's cinematic, right? It lends itself really well to the cinematic panning and detail work. But two things really stand out, well, three, in a world of history paintings that's copying models of Christian martyrdom from the death of General Wolfe on forward. One is this is a painting by an American artist, and the British flag is the flag that we're rooting for. So he's hanging on to that hyphenated British America that he was born in. Two is that the central heroic figure avenging the death of Major Pearson, a minor major, is a figure of African descent and was an actual enslaved person from the Carolinas who took the promise of the British Army and followed it, first from the Carolinas, then down through Jamaica and over to the Isle of Jersey. And then the third is this little group on your right, the proper left of the painting, of women and children in flight, which is really atypical in a battle painting. I don't know that there's such an example anywhere else in the film. And Copley's wife, daughter, and son modeled for him, and they are refugees of the American War. So as storytelling, it's a battle that Britain could still win. It's in that black figure, the idea of British liberty as being, if you think of Chris Brown in the film, England at this point is at least ambivalently anti-slavery, and that's chalk one up for the British side. And then it's the incredible damage to this family that was done, the silver lining of which Copley then got to paint like this. This was shown in Green Park in London, tented. It was a major event to go and see the picture and identify all of the people. I was thinking as you were talking about the ways that you use the paintings in the film, people with 18th century eyes knew how to do that detail work with this kind of painting, which we've since lost, right? And I would suspect that in the Met's galleries, when people are walking by British and European history paintings, there's a lot of just through traffic because we don't know how to read them. Maybe Ken Burns and Florentine Films' American Revolution will teach us how to read history paintings again.
At least not spend more time staring at the description card in the lower right-hand corner than you do at the painting. Oh, who is that? Oh, that's Sargent? Yeah, oh, okay.
So here is Copley early, right, with the portrait of Paul Revere, and this is such an amazing portrait. You know, you have all of these elements empire that are in it. There's the mahogany table, you know, a big commodity early in the colonial period. There's the teapot, right? Tea. There's silver from South America. And Copley himself looks like he's, excuse me, not Copley, Revere himself looks like he's about to kind of, you know, write his reflections, what he's thinking up here in, you know, on this reflective surface. His burin is on the table. He's a character, Paul Revere, that's super familiar to us, but kind of a one-hit wonder, right? The British are coming again, one of these.
Which
The
he never
regulars
said.
are coming out, the regulars are coming out.
So how do you deal with this, Ken, with some of these characters who are super important in the moment, but kind of have become these, you know, farcical
First of all,
types?
you have to just correct, make the adjustments. But you're right to digest the Copley, because for me, using it, you go, wait a second, could he possibly be this radical guy? Is he really one of these things? Because it has such an amazing thing, but he has dimension. It's the quality of the face that draws you to him. And so I think for us, you're always trying to figure out the historical record, what happens. Yes, it's oneth by sea and twoeth by land, you know, and all of the, you know, whatever the poem is. That's how we've learned it, and we just had to spend most of the 10 years trying to get all of that stuff right and to make him more than just that two-dimensional figure, just as Washington, who obviously takes up way, and legitimately so, more screen time with all of his undertow. There's not much undertow to Paul Revere, but he plays a role that's beyond the mislabeled, the British are coming. He doesn't say that. The regulars are coming out. And he is one of two guys who are initially set off. One's a land route and one's a water route, and to determine that the British are going across the Cambridge marshes and are going to attack that way. And they're warning particularly Sam Adams and John Hancock, who are hiding in Lexington to get the hell out of there, which they do. And then, as everybody knows, what happens the next morning.
Yeah, and in the film, this story here of Bloody Massacre, of the Boston Massacre is
Back up 5 years and a month, right?
Yes. And here we have this print, which has such a rich history in itself. And I encourage everybody to go up to the Revolution, exclamation mark, the exhibition upstairs, which includes one of these. There are many of these, and there are reproductions of it that get made over the course of the 19th century. But it's a print that has an interesting origin. Jane, could you talk about that just for a minute?
So among his many other roles, Paul Revere's a thief. The original of this print was done by Copley's half-brother, Henry Pelham, the boy with the squirrel well, he's the boy, not the squirrel, in Boy with a Squirrel. Revere images are commonly pirated, right? There's no idea of copyright or intellectual property in the way that we hold it now. And Revere takes it, punches it up, adds quite conspiratorial elements to the picture. There's a mysterious gun firing from the Custom House window. There's a second shooter. And titles it the Bloody Massacre, and I think realizes, so this is March of 1770, the people of Boston have had 5 or 6 years of organizing a resistance movement, chiefly through print. I can't think of a galvanizing image between Join or Die in 1754 and the image of the Bloody Massacre. Revere realizes that a copperplate engraving at a reasonable price can sear this event into the minds of people all up and down the colonies. People wouldn't have had it hand-colored like this. They would have had it in black and white. The visual culture of 18th century America is an overwhelmingly black and white world, but it's really telegraphic storytelling of a situation that is volatile in precisely the way that Minneapolis is today, right? It's impossible to see this scene and not think of a winter people confronting an occupying force in an American city, and of the way that images from that battle are arguably turning the tide in people's power in the country. So Revere is taking a bet on images, and poor young Henry Pelham is just kind of amazed that that his drawing is lifted and then goes big. This is also the time that Revere does his image of the landing of the British troops in Boston, which has happened 2 years before, but coupled with the scene of the British massacre, it tells a not actually true story of an occupying force that came bent on this kind of destruction and then achieved it.
And we used both of them in the film and ended up actually using the Met's version of this when looking around the world and the country of which one to use.
And as much as the Minneapolis analogy is obviously quite apt, I also felt when we were working on the film, maybe it was coming from Vietnam, that the assassination by the South Vietnamese commander on the scene of this captured North Vietnamese Viet Cong spy on the streets of Saigon, which is so galvanic in the other way in the United States, had that kind of, incredibly transforming quality to it.
In this image, I love the way that whoever hand-colored it decided to put Crispus Attucks in there by coloring one of the faces in a little darker. And that's one of the really interesting things about these prints that circulated so widely, is that people interacted with them in different ways. And Join or Die had a really wide circulation because it was in a newspaper in Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette. And it shows this snake, right, which has the colonies in it: South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and New England, right, up at the top. And it's, it's signaling, right, that power comes. The snake has its power if it's all together. And I love in the film how the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, is really referenced as this kind of, this model. And Phil, I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
I mean, there's kind of two ways that this actually plays out. And one way in the film, right, is an actual admonition from Haudenosaunee people saying, like, you can do better if you confederate like us, right? This sort of direct kind of thing. A second part of it is this sort of sense that, at the Albany meeting earlier on, Franklin had sort of looked at the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and said, I have an idea here, right? So there's always been an interesting kind of debate about Haudenosaunee influence on sort of the idea about American unification and confederation that's oftentimes taken shape around, I'm gesturing up at the screen that we can see, apologies, taken shape around this, this particular kind of image. I mean, the irony of this, I think, goes to the ways in which the film tries to complicate the war, and one of those tropes is that this is a civil war. And so, you can imagine if this is a Haudenosaunee sort of picture, like join, confederate, therefore you will succeed and live, that the war itself actually is divisive, where, Tuscaroras and Oneidas sort of split off and aligned with the Americans, Mohawks with the British, and so the Haudenosaunee Confederacy itself is put in some jeopardy, right, by the war. And at the same time, I think it's worth saying, that's not the downfall of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy at this moment. It is the incredibly devastating military strategy of George Washington. This war begins with the devastation of the Cherokee and is punctuated by the devastation of Haudenosaunee people, right, in this massive campaign across New York, which itself is, I think we should note, a scouting campaign for future settlement, right? These soldiers who are saying, like, this looks pretty good. These guys have got some great cornfields. I think I'm coming back here afterwards. And that is, in fact, what happens. And it is also just worth remembering, right, that the war may be declared over at the Treaty of Paris, but for Native people, this war does not end. It keeps going, and it keeps going, and arguably it keeps going all the way through the 19th century.
Yeah, It's really important. Franklin, actually, let's remember, this is 20 years before the Revolution. Franklin has studied everything. He's interested because he's the postmaster in figuring out how to unite. But the Haudenosaunee, which is sometimes called the Iroquois Confederacy, and it's made up of first 5 and then 6 tribes, which are the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Tuscarora, Oneida, and Mohawk peoples, have been on the world scene and have this confederacy, as they call it, which has united them in their global diplomatic and military and economic power, but has permitted the individual identities of the nations to remain intact. And Franklin says, you know, if these savages can do this, why can't we? So the Albany Plan, 20 years, fails completely because the people who go to Albany, the 7 states, are happy to ratify the Plan of Union. One of the spokesmen for the Haudenosaunee says that ours is a powerful confederacy. Remember, never fall out one with the other. This is an admonition to us, which ought to still, you know, reverberate. It's why it's in a central position in the beginning of our film. And then, of course, the war brings division because of alliances within the Haudenosaunee that have been made, as Phil said, with British or Americans. And then the Sullivan Campaign, ordered by Washington, basically just rips it completely apart. And it's the Continental Army, remember? It's not the Eastern Seaboard Army. We knew from the very beginning where we were going.
Yeah, the Continental.
Right? We know where we're going. And we can't, it's the Continental Congress. It's not the Eastern Seaboard Congress. We know where we're going. It's all the way to Washington State.
Yeah. We're almost out of time. I want to end with one image, though, because I'm a professor at Penn, which is the nation's oldest university, founded by this man, Benjamin Franklin. This is an amazing painting, and it's up in Revolution in the American wing. And I love this frame that encircles this very modest fellow in his little scruffy fur-collared coat. That snake, the rattlesnake, is up at the top going across, and then there's a muskrat and a Phrygian cap, a liberty cap at the bottom, and the inscription, VIR, in Latin, meaning man or hero. So Ken, can you take us out by just thinking for a minute about Franklin as this man and this hero, and this difference between the common people and the ruling class that is kind of taken apart by the revolution, and how the resolution, the possible resolution of those differences, might be at the heart of this revolution?
That's a wonderful question. I can only tilt it just slightly. This is, if anybody else could share the prize of indispensable with George Washington, it's Benjamin Franklin. He's much older than anybody else. and her guy.
Thomas Jefferson?
Her guy, yeah.
Jefferson.
The
We like him too.
Most responsible for the success of the revolution. And I'll get to Jane. I think I can help. I can dig myself out of the hole I've just dug. He's born in a middle or lower class in Boston. He's actually an indentured servant to his own brother. He escapes that thing. He arrives in Philadelphia penniless and without anything, and he makes himself into somebody, but he also realizes that he's never going to be in that upper class. He's not going to be a Jefferson or an Adams or anything like that, unless he also brings along this whole working merchant class of people. And so he begins the first lending library. He's looking for civic improvements. He's invented us before we've invented ourselves. When he's an envoy in Paris, and getting the French aid is the coup that makes the revolution possible, he also is having this thing printed up in French. And it is a much more repressive regime than the monarchy across the English Channel. It is oppressive, and these ideas that are born in Montesquieu as well as in the Scottish Enlightenment are being put, or trying to be put, into tangible manifestation in the United States, called the United States of America. He's emblematic of all the things, the the attempt to rise through class. He is the elder statesman at all these places. He is the person who is able to forge a lot of the compromises, both genius and tragic, that are at the heart of the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787. He actually has owned other human beings in his household and has kind of let them kind of sort of leave. And then by the end of his life, he's proposing an anti-slavery petition. It's a remarkable arc of a life, and there's a simplicity to him. He's a great writer. He may be the best of all the writers there. It is Thomas Jefferson's words that he edits. Thomas Jefferson says, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable," and that would be a good argument, taking these new, untested Enlightenment ideas and saying, you know, sacred and undeniable, listen to our argument. And Franklin says, no, you know, self-evident. Well, there is nothing self-evident about these truths, right, at that moment. And I like the boldness of changing it. And someone in our Franklin film, as Stacy remembers, says, it's the old lawyer's dodge. Tell them that it's true, and then you're halfway to convincing them that it is, you know. Sort of like we know that January 6th didn't happen, right? It didn't happen, right? So Franklin helps in all of that. And from the very beginning, the first stirrings of union and connection, to all of the stuff of getting it done, the money and the diplomacy. And I've neglected the fact he's the greatest scientist of the 18th century. He is the most famous American on earth because he has understood the principles of electricity, right? He's an inventor. He has done all these things. He is what everybody in Europe, they love him. They want to be him. And he presents himself in the French court in ordinary kind of journeyman costume and not playing as probably Washington, if he was there, would be in the regality of the uniform. It's a magnificent performance as a human being, and he's one of the most interesting people I've gotten to know. And I think that he doesn't fire a gun in anger, but his weapon, both his tongue and his mind and his heart and his understanding that the cause, as he says, is not just for us, it's for everybody. What's so extraordinary about them all, Jefferson and Adams and Washington and everybody, they are talking about us all the way through. They don't have a snowball's chance in hell on Lexington Green, but they're still thinking about the untold millions yet unborn, the millions yet unborn, John Adams says, and that's us. And so then the responsibility of all these images and all these faces staring back at us is really a pretty accurate mirror that is asking you, what are you going to do?
I think that's a really great question for all of us right now to consider. I want to thank you all so much for this evening, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.